I just took apart my audio recording setup, moved things around in my space with help from my wife, and then added a UA Volt 876 to my recording setup to solve a problem related to limited audio input sources. I'm gonna walk you through my 3-step process to remediate the challenge, the technical setup, and then demonstrate the results, which of course involves recording guitars. Step 1, the problem statement. About 3 years ago, my wife introduced me to the wonderful world of vinyl. For as long as I can remember, I've had stereo headphones or a home recording studio where I listen to music for enjoyment and research using platforms like Apple Music, Tidal, and so on. Everything I recorded as an individual or with a band routed through either Pro Tools or Ableton Live, which I reference through the same recording equipment I use to study and listen to great music. Basically, I'm always in a studio environment of some kind. Today, I'm hooked on vinyl. I grew up listening to my parents' records on vinyl, and because I lived in the type of city apartments that are not exactly conducive to loud listening environments, and I moved around a lot for most of my adult life, I just never got back into it. That all changed when my wife advocated for a record player, and then I became obsessed with reading the credits, engineering notes, lyric sheets, and finding music I haven't listened to in years all through vinyl. For me, there is nothing like the experience of spinning your favorite album on vinyl. The audio recording nomenclature can be a bit esoteric at times, but once you hear the subtle nuances of the room sound in a recording, it becomes part of the magic, at least in my mind. It's like seeing a photo that perfectly captures a moment in time. That is what being able to hear the room feels like to me. I hear it more on vinyl than I ever did when I listened to music, primarily in a studio environment. Things like weird artifacts or a count-in from the drummer in a song you've heard a million times and just never noticed. Things like bleed into one microphone from a different source, like an amp in the room, coming through the drum mics and vice versa. Sure, part of the recording process could be to isolate vocals, drums, guitars, keys, and whatever is being recorded for an album in a way that segments the band's performance to prevent that sort of bleed, like the interesting things Eric Valentine did with Songs for the Deaf, but the sound of the room itself is still likely present. If you like the sound of a bluesy strat, you've no doubt listened to the album Continuum from John Mayer. To my ears, that album is an excellent example of being pulled into the music in a way that makes me feel like I'm in the room during the performance. I get that same feeling from every Tom Waits album I spin, along with the Robert Cray Band, Failure, Hum, Toadies, Wolf Mother, Wolf Parade, Oasis, Grizzly Bear, Nathaniel Rateliff and the Night Sweats, Living Colour, Tool, American Football, Farrakhan, and the list goes on. One day I was having coffee and writing while listening to Sound and Color by Alabama Shakes and Dog Ear by the Brothers Landreth, and I wondered, what would these albums sound like if they were recorded using amp modelers and virtual drum kits like I often use? That was the day I decided to turn my room apart and run cables all over the place to record my real amplifiers. And now I can't go back, at least not entirely. There will likely always be a place for amp modelers in my recording and live performance process. For example, most of the gigs I've had in recent years have been at yoga studios during a practice that involves meditation. Using something like Universal Audio's line of amp and cab emulator pedals is going to be a much better option than an amp played at volume, pointed at the people lying on the floor, trying to rest in Shavasana, while I work to achieve an edge of breakup tone at 110 decibels. I'm probably not going to be invited back to that space anytime soon. Also, it's great to have the flexibility of playing through an amp emulator the moment creativity strikes. I can get a killer tone in a matter of minutes, and beyond recording an idea for a song, the tone is so realistic, I can always use the recording for short, quick projects. Things like recording a background track to sit under a voiceover for a promo or hype video. When it comes to recording my real amps, having a limited number of audio inputs was getting in the way of my creativity. Every time I wanted to use a mic in front of the guitar amp, I had to move a bunch of cables around, which is fine. It's not hard in the way shoveling hot asphalt in Illinois in the middle of August is hard, but it was causing a lot more work than I could mentally process during moments of creativity. I kept making easily avoidable mistakes, like forgetting the SM57 in front of my Laurel Canyon was still plugged into my Apollo, not the SM57 I thought I was recording through in front of my Benson Monarch Reverb. So here I am troubleshooting this tinny, weak signal, thinking my mic died or the cable died, or that I had done something weird in console, only to realize I just forgot to switch connections after I recorded the idea using one mic instead of the two I intended to record through because the second mic's recording was completely unusable. I could, of course, just move the physical mic every time I wanted to record one amp or the other, but one of my requirements is to keep two mics in place once I capture the tone I'm satisfied with so that I can rest easy knowing that I can overdub if needed using the same tone I've already been recording. I could, of course, mark the grill cloth with tape and then mark the floor so I know where to place the mic stand in the exact location I want it to be every time I move it around. But I like to record two amps at once sometimes using two mics on each amp. And really, I just want to leave the mics where they are so I can focus on the guitar performance since it's just me here acting as engineer and also performer. So my problem statement becomes, I need additional audio inputs to support a variety of audio sources while simplifying the technical setup to support myriad configurations simultaneously. Step 2, planning and design. Before I get started unplugging cables and installing new hardware, I want to make sure that I can refer back to my intended outcome and also a project list just to stay on track so I don't forget steps along the way. Whenever I get started on a big project, I like to use a user story template. So if you take a look at my screen, you can see that I've got a user story ID and there's 10 user stories that I've come up with. And it goes like this. As a guitar player, I want to have access to creative tools so that I can enjoy playing my instrument. Lately, I've been helping people get to know macOS 26.x, which is Tahoe. And that got me thinking about Lake Tahoe, which is a place I've been to in my younger days when I would ski a lot. And I was thinking about how guitar playing in a lot of ways is kind of like the enjoyment of doing something like snow skiing, meaning I would snow ski with my family for enjoyment. Like we put our skis on and the outfit and we get on the lift and we're cruising down the side of a mountain with the cold air hitting us and we're laughing and having a good time. And there's something about that experience that makes us feel happy to be alive. And really, when it comes down to it, that is why I play guitar. There's really no other activity that makes me feel the way playing a guitar makes me feel. It allows me to access feelings and express those feelings in a way that no other activity really can. And I also experience it when I listen to music, but in particular when I'm playing the music myself, it gets me to that place. So that's like user story number 1. I just want to be able to play the guitar creatively because it makes me happy, and I love guitars and amps. Now, the second user story is, as a guitar player, I want to have quick access to record guitar so that I can write songs and share those on Spotify, on YouTube, and write songs that I put to voiceover for training videos and that type of thing because I enjoy making songs as well. I really enjoy that. As a guitar player, I want to have flexibility for recording various input sources and record in myriad formats. I want to be able to record in mono. I want to be able to record in stereo. I want to be able to record amp plugins. I want to record actual amps with a microphone in front of them. I want to be able to record vocals. I want to be able to record whatever I'm feeling inspired to record at any given time. From a commercial aspect, monetizing the love I have for guitars, I want to be able to simplify my setup. I make a song, I put the song out there, some famous artist buys it and goes and records it. Or a song that I write that's instrumental gets picked up and used in a big company's YouTube video, and all of a sudden they want me to make videos for them all the time. Or even better, I'm writing songs for film scores now. That's kind of one of my goals with all of this. So the most important user story in this entire list, from my perspective, is as an independent recording engineer, I want to simplify my setup so that I can reduce points of failure. We're going to get to that in just a second because I have an actual example of a point of failure that kind of inspired this whole project. Now, if I go to the second tab, my to-do list, you can see that I've got a bunch of stuff I want to do as part of this implementation, installing the new hardware. I have to document my current I/O mapping in Console, the application that I use to manage all of these inputs and audio interfaces. I also need to review my amp plugin settings to make sure that my virtual channels are routed the way they need to be so that I can record them. I want to save my plugin presets, and I want to make sure that I get the Volt software installed only after I confirm that my Volt is in ADAT mode and that I can see the new input channels. I got to mount the 876, and then I got to configure the 876 for ADAT mode before I plug it into the computer. I want to check to make sure that my sound still works, and then I'm going to verify the console mapping for the new inputs. And then I have to make sure that I update my input sources in my digital audio workstation, which in my case is Ableton Live. That means whenever I go to record a new track, I can choose one of the various inputs for whatever it is I'm recording. Maybe I'm recording a microphone for voiceover. Maybe I'm recording 2 microphones in front of an amp cap, or maybe I'm recording 4 microphones when I'm playing guitar in stereo through 2 amplifiers and a vocal mic. I want to be able to do all of that stuff without having to think, is everything plugged in? Am I forgetting something? I just want it to kind of be there in place so that whenever I'm creative and feeling inspired, I can just go. So if I go over to this hilarious diagram that I built that looks like it has a bunch of crayon drawings, you can see what I'm currently working with. If I look at where I'm at right now, I'm just sitting here with a guitar. I've got a couple of options. I can go from my guitar into my pedal board, from the pedal board into either the Benson amp or my matchless, or I can actually run in stereo to both amps at the same time, which is super awesome if I'm doing things with the Big Sky and a delay pedal or whatever else I'm running through. I can split that signal so that I can play through both amps simultaneously. The other option that I have is I can run through the pedal board as described and then send that signal not through the speaker cone, but into my universal audio aux to record a virtual version of this speaker cone with microphones in a studio environment that is completely virtual, that lives inside this box essentially. And then from there, I go into the ADAT connection of the Apollo X4, which goes from the Thunderbolt connection into my computer, so that I can use the universal audio software and then make a decision about what to do with that, which I would probably just send directly into my digital audio workstation, which again is Ableton Live in my case. So that's one option. The other option is I can run my guitar into my Neve DI and then send that signal into my quad cortex, which I route back into the universal audio inputs 3 and 4. The reason I do that is because I can record a DI track here on line 1. So in my recording session in Ableton, I can record a DI signal as well as a stereo signal using these 2 inputs to get the quad cortex sound. I would do that if I was going to send a mix engineer a performance that I recorded and they're like, you know what, I hate the way that this quad cortex sounds, or it's just not right for the context of the song, we wanted to change direction. If they have a DI recording, they can reamp the performance into whatever kind of amp or even into another digital emulation of an amp at their studio to match whatever context is needed. What I'm finding is that I actually don't record DI tracks that often because it's usually just me recording into my software. I'll just re-record the performance if I want and then commit that sound to the recording. I don't really use DI tracks anymore other than just like an emergency backup, which I never have used in like the last 5 years. So I'm going to move away from using the Neve DI in this way. And the other reason that I want to move away from that is if you look at the input number 1 here on my Apollo X4, there's a guitar icon next to it, and that's because this is a high Z port. That's important because the impedance for a high Z connection is important for what I'll talk about in a little while. And what I do from there is set my amp modeling plugins to look at input 1, which is the Neve DI, and then I can create a sound with the amp. And then when I go to record in my DAW, I'm recording 2 tracks. The DI track, which is a totally neutral recording of the guitar performance, and then I'll have a second track where I record the actual amp sound. Now, you could also record a DI track and then apply an amp plugin to the DI track once you have it recorded, and then that way you just have that DI track and you can switch out plugins on the fly, which is also super cool. Not something I do very often. So that's what's going on in my setup right now. And what happened was I was recording my Benson amp the other day. When I sat down to record, I thought I was recording the SM57 and the Oma ribbon mic that were in front of my Benson amp. But what I was actually recording was this other SM57 that I forgot to unplug from the back of my Apollo. So I'm recording this amp thinking that I'm using this microphone and it sounds terrible, when really I was recording the microphone that was several feet away and sounded awful. If I look at the input on the back of this console, which is physically hard to get to sometimes the way that I have my office set up, I'm moving cables around pretty often to change the configuration for whatever it is I'm recording at the time. Now, the reason that I wouldn't just move the same mic from this amplifier over to this amplifier is because if I record something on my Benson, for example, and I have two microphones going into it and I get them in phase and I'm happy with how it sounds, I don't want to change that until I know that I'm happy with the recording and I'm going to move on from it and let go of that configuration. Because if I record a part, I go back to listen to it and I'm thinking to myself, I really want to do that again. I want the tone to match so I can, through my performance, quickly get back to a similar sound if I'm punching in or something like that. Now, if I move the mic around, I may or may not get it back into the exact same spot it was in, and that may or may not be detectable when I go to punch in. It really depends on how good I am at matching that tone. The safest way is to just leave it in place and not mess with it. In order to do that, that means that if I want to have a different mic in front of a different amp at a different physical location, then I have to change the connection. If I'm not going to move the mic, I got to change the connection. And that is when I ran into problems, because you can see I've got 1, 2, 3 sources competing for that single input. And when I'm in the creative mode that I get into when I want to record, that's not the thing I want to be thinking about. I just want to sit down and record. So when I thought about what I wanted to accomplish, going back to that user story about being able to record myriad input sources and the big one of simplifying the process and reducing points of failure, then my future state begins to look like this. So here I am again, and I have either a bass guitar or a 6-string guitar. And now I've got all kinds of options, because what I just did in this diagram was add an additional 8 ports to my existing audio interface using the Volt 876 in ADAT mode. So now I have 4 plus 8 additional inputs for a total of 12, which is way more than I need in the studio, but it gives me the flexibility to set things up and leave things set up in a way that is conducive to that creative space I want to fall into when I'm ready to just go. So if you look at the setup here, so let's say I'm using my 6-string guitar. I've got a couple of options now. As I mentioned, I'm going to go into the high Z port moving forward, and that happens to be on the front of the Volt 876. And I started to wonder, is that even possible? I wanted to make sure that I don't have to specifically use the high Z port on the Apollo. And because I wanted to be super sure that would actually work, I did some research looking at the manual for the 876 to ensure that I would be able to run my instrument into input 1 and leverage high Z. In theory, that should work. I'm going to test it out, make sure that everything works. But as a backup, I'm actually going to have a space for the Neve DI that I can still run and do things the way that I'm used to. But I don't have any doubt about that high Z connection working just fine in ADAT mode on the 876. So I can also plug my bass guitar into that same high Z port now to record bass tracks. And because I'm linking things like the Parallax plugin from Neural DSP to input 1, I'll just change that in the software to look for a different input, and then I should be able to leverage that high Z port, probably even get a better sound than I have been getting because I bypassed the best practice and went through a DI instead, and that worked for me for a very long time just fine. I'm happy with the way it sounded. Now, I still can run into the quad cortex, but what I'll do is go through either input 1 or input 2, probably input 1 for bass and guitar, because that's how I set my sessions up, but I could easily change that inside the session, no problem. And now I can dedicate outputs left and right from the quad cortex to go into the Volt 876. And then I'll link those 2 inputs in console so that I have a stereo pair. And that way I can just record that one stereo pair in my digital audio workstation, and I don't have to record 2 separate mono tracks when I'm recording the Neural DSP. And the other option, of course, is that I can take my guitar, run it into the pedal board like I always have, and then again, record the amps now. But what I can do is dedicate all 4 of the inputs on the Apollo X4 to recording guitar. The reason I want to use those 4 inputs specifically is because I can leverage the unison block to load preamps and get a great signal coming into console from 4 microphones that I can just leave in place now without having to move things around, which is so awesome. And I still have the option to run one of those 2 amps at any given time into the aux, which I have documented down here, now goes to the input of the Volt 876. One exciting option is that I'll be able to run the Rode NTG back into my console, which I used to do a lot of the time, but I got tired of like moving the connections around and ended up just recording directly into the camera a lot of the time. So if you look at the way this is set up, I'm just running my microphone into the camera, which is totally fine, except that it doesn't sound all that great. I have to do a lot of work in Adobe Premiere or export the audio and clean it up in Ableton Live. Now what I can do is run that NTG into the Volt 876 and apply subtle compression and maybe a little bit of EQ up front and get a better recording going in so that I don't have to spend as much time cleaning that stuff up later, which is awesome. Okay, so moving into what I'm doing with the computer, still connecting the Apollo X4 to the computer over Thunderbolt. And then what I'll do after I set the Volt 876 to ADAT mode and I confirm that I can see it in console and the additional inputs, I can go ahead and run that USB connection into my computer because this is in standalone ADAT mode now and it's not going to try to take over. And now I can load UA Connect and go to Volt interfaces and install the software for the Volt interface so that I can configure the inputs for like vintage mode or whatever I want to do with that particular input. But I don't want to do that too soon because it could mess up console if I have 2 audio interfaces plugged in that are both fighting for primary. That is one thing I definitely want to avoid because I don't want to spend a lot of time troubleshooting that mess. With this setup, I can run the guitar into the Volt using the high Z input as we talked about. And what I'll end up with is an input that has that high Z connection coming in, and I'll turn the gain down all the way, which is the best practice for the new amp modeling plugin that I'm going to show you that is super cool. I can open the Paradise Guitar Studio and take advantage of that high Z input that I haven't been using because I used the Neve DI and probably end up with a much better sound. I'm looking forward to finding out. But let's hear how it sounds right now. So if I go over to my Benson Mixwave plugin, let's just see how this sounds. I'm going to grab a guitar real quick. Now you can see analog 2 is the vocal microphone. That's why you're seeing the meter active when I talk. And now if I turn the amp on, you'll see that virtual 1 and 2 signal increase because it's going through the amp now. So I'll unmute those. Sounds like an amp, right? If I point my guitar this way, I get less hum. And if I bring it back over here, which is where the camera's facing, I get more hum. So I apologize. You hear that? But if I just listen to this, it sounds great. I'm getting a little bit of delay in the sound, and that's because I have a whole lot of stuff running right now, so the latency is pretty intense. But if I wanted to go into the reverb and like really add some reverb. Pretty cool, right? Now check this out. I'm gonna mute virtual 1 and 2. And again, a lot of times what I'll do is just link those two. And let me just show you what that does. So that's the stereo signal, and now I can just record one track in stereo for that amp plugin. Turn that off, I'll turn this off, and I'm gonna close the Chimera and go over into Ableton Live. And you can see that I've got the Paradise Guitar Studio loaded up, which just came out and is super cool. And I'll change my input to in. You can hear it humming because I'm running a D-style amp. And this is just an out-of-the-box plugin preset. And let's just hear how it sounds. Pretty cool, right? That you can just load an amp plugin like that and get an awesome tone. That was an out-of-the-box preset, and I was just kind of messing around. Nothing super structured on the guitar. I could also go plug my amps in and be ready to go to record at volume in this room at any time to use my real amps. And I love having the flexibility of all these creative options because I use them in different contexts. You know, if I'm writing a song for a voiceover, it's going to be played at a much lower volume, and a lot of people are probably going to be listening to it on their iPhones. So I don't care as much about a super authentic guitar tone in that context as much as, you know, I'm recording a track for an album that I want to put out, or an EP or a single, where I actually do want to record the feeling and the tone that I get from my amps, from the pedals that I love from boutique manufacturers that inspire me to want to play the guitar. That's why I'm doing this, and I want to be able to take advantage of those settings. Going back to the DAW, if I close this plugin and I go to my settings, I click audio, and I go into my input config, this is going to be super important once I have the Volt up and running, because I want to include the new inputs from the Volt. I did want to mention that before I got started down this path, I did make a phone call to my Sweetwater rep, and I explained my current setup, which of course he knew about because he sold me the gear. I talked a little bit about what I wanted to accomplish by extending my available input sources and why I was thinking about that. Originally, I would have gone with the pre-Sonos Octapre because I've used it in the past. It was amazing. I love the product, but I did wonder if there were other options available. Because the Volt 876 runs in ADAT mode, and I'm already using universal audio for pretty much everything I do going into my computer and then subsequently my DAW, it made sense for me to go with the Volt 876 because it's that same universal audio product line, and I can manage things a lot easier using that suite of products than if I were to go with another vendor. And I love the other products, of course, and like I mentioned, I have used the pre-Sonos Octapre in the past when I first got started, and it was awesome. I introduced that into my product line so that I could record drums during live band practices. I did want to mention that with the Volt 876, if you have a need for even more inputs, there's a way that you can stack those units. I think you can stack up to 3 and get 24 inputs. So you can have, you know, your singer, your bass player, your guitar player, your drum session, the keyboardist, if you have a horn section that's using mics, and record your band essentially using the Volt 876 in a stacked way rather than using it as a standalone ADAT unit the way that I'm going to do. So if you look at the manual here, the ADAT expansion and sample rate section is where you can read more about combining 3 876 units, one as the interface unit, and then you've got an ADAT expander, which is different than standalone ADAT mode that I'm using. So in this configuration, you've got the primary unit, and then you've got the expander units. I think you can add up to 3, like I said. So that's 24 inputs you can get out of this, and then you get a ton of options in terms of what you can record and how much gear you can record into your DAW of choice. That's very cool, and I'm glad I reached out and had that conversation and got what I think is the right solution for what I'm trying to accomplish when I go back to my intended outcome of simplifying my setup to reduce points of failure. That includes trying to configure all of this stuff and make it work together. I think it's going to be pretty smooth, and now I'm going to move into the next phase of this implementation and actually set the unit up, mount it, and then change all the cable configurations around based on those diagrams I showed you earlier. Step 3, implementation and revisions. Now that I've thought through the basic diagram that I want to manage my setup to visually, I went ahead and took that a step further. So check this out. You can see now that I have an input diagram set up. And here on the left, I've got the Apollo X4, and I haven't started the migration yet. And so this is just a simple, not started in progress, block completed, basic project management type Google sheet. And over here, I've got channel ID. So right now the X4 is being used as an instrument connection. So I could use the high Z port, but really it's that Neve DI as we talked about. And then mic line 2 is the SMB. That's this mic I'm talking into right now. And then I have mic line 3 and mic line 4 set up for either the Neural QC, which I run in stereo as a stereo pair, or I'm running the OMA ribbon mic or the SM57 through that currently. And then my ADAT in connection is the aux box. All of this is not available because I haven't installed the Volt 876 yet. And then over here, you can see that I have the new input source mapped out. So on the X4, I'm going to dedicate those first 4 inputs all for guitar so that I can use the unison slot for various preamps, like probably the 610, and a lot of times I'll run the Helios 69 in the unison slot. I'll do some subtle EQ there, and sometimes I might even run the Century Tube channel strip, and of course I can run the Neve 1073, which I still need to spend a little bit more time learning, so I don't use that one as often for guitar. I use it a lot on vocals, actually, but primarily I'll use the 610 or the Helios Type 69 in the unison slot when recording real amps. And then I might run some other, compression type stuff or whatever fun plugin I want to load in the additional inserts. So if I look at the front of the Volt 876, which I have pulled up here from the manual on UA's website, you can see that input 1 and input 2 are both in the front of the device. I like that I can take the SMB connection and access that front panel to switch it out if I ever want to use a different microphone or something like that. And then moving to the back of the Volt 876, I'll have mic line 3 and 4 dedicated to the Neural Quad Cortex that I'll pair in stereo. And then mic line 5 is going to be my Rode NTG, which I'll use for filming. And then I'll pair that audio with the scratch track on the camera so that I can sync those 2 audio files, which is why you'll see me recording a lot in 48 kilohertz instead of 44.1 kilohertz, because I do a lot of film stuff. If I was just recording audio, I'd probably either just run in 44.1 or 96. But for what I do with a lot of filming, 48 results in less float. When I go from the scratch track in the camera, using the audio like right out of the camera using a mic, and then the audio that I record in Ableton, I have a lot less float in the audio. It stays in sync even with longer video shoots. Every time I switch back and forth, I have to change my plugins, I have to change my DAW. It's a lot of stuff to remember, and going back to that initial intention, I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible. So I just keep it at 48 kilohertz for the most part. So going back to my diagram here, you can see that I'm gonna put the Neve DI in mic line input 6. And then here's something that's fun. I was cleaning up my room, getting ready for the move, and I completely forgot that I have some stuff that I want to add to my setup. So I've got my MIDI keyboard. You can see my Bird Fight Records sticker here on the top left of the keyboard. And I want to bring that back to the top of my desk because I miss playing keys. A lot of times when I load a virtual instrument or a synth plugin, I prefer to use the tactile keys rather than the control surface, like on the Push 2, for example, which is awesome. I use that for all kinds of stuff too, especially if I'm automating movement within a track. I can use the Push 2 to record those automations. I could also use this Novation as the control surface in Ableton, but really I just use it as a keyboard, and then I leverage the plugin for the sound. I'll just close my eyes and make it sound like a piano or a warbly synth or whatever I'm running. And it's also a good way for me to practice music theory, to have that keyboard right there where I can access it. And I kind of ran out of space, so I haven't used this in a while, and I'm excited to bring it back into the fold. And also check this out. I completely forgot. I have a mini Ampeg, so it's the Micro VR, and this thing is awesome because on the back of it, you'll see that I've got an XLR out, a line out, and it's even got an effects loop. And then over here, I can run into a cabinet. Really, I can just record this directly into my DAW using an impulse response that's built into the amp and then get a great bass tone. So what I'm gonna do is run the Neve DI into the Volt 876 so that when I record bass, now I can use that DI track that I was talking about earlier that I don't really do anymore with the guitar parts. But with bass, I can have a DI track and then record into this, for example. So then I'll have 2 bass track recordings from one performance, and then I can use that DI track for the bass to emphasize the low end on the DI track and then blend it with something like this for an interesting tone that hopefully helps the mix out. And then I'll also have the option to duplicate the DI track and even load plugins on top of that, like Parallax or any of the Ampeg SVT plugins, or maybe just some saturation like the Saturn plugin. A lot of options there. And that leaves me with one open mic line input. That's pretty cool that I used all this stuff up and that I'll be able to have everything out and just leave it in place. The next tab I have here in my overall sheet, you'll see that I have an implementation steps project. This is everything I'm gonna do right now. So just running through the steps I'm gonna take, I'll mount the Volt 876, run power to the Volt 876, I'm not going to plug the USB in at this point, but I'll route the ADAT out from the 876 into the ADAT connection of the X4, power on the 876, configure the Volt 876 for ADAT mode, then I'll open Universal Audio Console, set the X4 as my primary clock source, verify the Volt 876 inputs show up, validate audio by playing a song on Apple Music just to make sure that everything's working okay. Then I'll verify the Volt software that I installed through UA Connect, reconfigure the Benson plugin, the Milkman plugin, the 2Rock plugin, the Parallax plugin, the SLO100 plugin, all for the new High-Z port that is on the Volt 876 instead of the Universal Audio X4. And then I'll update Ableton Live. It'll have a lot more available input sources, and I want to make sure that those are routed properly in the DAW so that I can quickly set up a new track in my recording session and then choose the input source for whatever it is I'm trying to record. And then I'll do 2 tracks, like I mentioned, for bass. One will be a DI track. The other track will be the micro SVT. And I could even do a 3rd track running something like Parallax and just mute everything that I don't want to hear but can still record, and then just reference one of those 3 sources for the performance, but record all of them so that I'll have a lot of options when I get into the mixing phase. Then I'll test all the connections on the X4. I'll probably just flick the microphone or do a snap test in front of every microphone to make sure that the meter registers the signal on every microphone connection. And I'll do the same thing on the 876. And then I'll configure the mic line input on the 876 for a stereo pair for the NeuroQuad Cortex in the particular guitar session that I'll run in Universal Audio Console for that connection. And then I'm going to record some guitar for this YouTube video. We'll see how that goes. Hopefully it works out. I'm hoping for the best. Let's unplug some cables. Right now, I'm thinking I might actually hold off on putting the aux in the signal chain. I'm not sure that I'm actually going to use this as often now that I have my mics amped in the room. So I'm wondering if maybe this is something that I can sell for now and use this to offset the cost of the Volt 876. This is just a game time decision that I arrived at while going through and unplugging everything to put it all back in place. So quick update there. I'll see you in a minute. Okay, so that's it. At this point, I'm gonna turn everything on, check all my connections. So after I set the Volt 876 to ADAT mode and make sure that I can see it in console, then I'll go through the process of validating all of my routing, make sure that the Apollo X4 is the clock source. Then I will check my output monitors to make sure that I'm getting sound. And at that point, I'll go through and open up my amp plugins and change the routing. Before, they would go through mic line 1 on the Apollo X4. And now my plugins are going to be looking for mic line input 1, the high Z port on the Volt 876. So my plugins won't get any signal until I change that in the audio settings for those plugins. So I'll go through and just make sure that the first one works. And then if that works, go through and change the other ones, and then test the neural quad cortex, then record some guitars after I do a snap test in front of the mics that are going to be used for miking the guitar caps. Step 4, repeat steps 1 through 3 iteratively. All right, so everything is set up now. The cables have been run, all the connections have been tested, and as I reflect back on this initial diagram that I set up, I'm very happy that I made the decision to go this route and document everything, starting with what I had in the X4 originally, and then what I'm using those connections for now with the addition of the new ADAT connections. So I can always come back to this diagram now if I want to make changes in the future, and then I can use this diagram to update my current settings. So right now I've got 2 open analog inputs, input 7 and 8 on the Volt 876. So those are sitting there open. And really, I could change the way I have the Neve DI and the micro VR set up if I find that I'm not using those connections as I start using the studio more and recording more stuff. So that is to be determined. But right now I've got that flexibility to record really 2 DI tracks because I'm running the high Z cable into mic line 1 of the Volt 876. Then I'm sending that to the Neve DI. So that's 2 DIs that I can record, and then record the micro VR separately. And then I could also run plugins like the Parallax or the Ampeg SVT suite on top of that. So a whole bunch of options there, probably more than I could ever need. And simplifying that will make the recording process a lot smoother. So I'll spend more time figuring out what tone works best for me. And that'll probably become my, gold standard here in the studio because it works. And when I'm getting into a creative space, that's the whole idea, is that I can just turn this stuff on and go. So if we come back to my visual diagram and look at what was originally the current state, just as a reminder, I had all kinds of problems. And that was why I went through this whole process. So moving on to what I thought would be the current state. An improvement for sure, but there was some flaws in my initial design. For example, if you look at the way I've got the aux running into the ADAT in of the Volt 876, that was a miscalculation on my part because the Volt 876 can actually send 16 channels out. And if you look here, you've got out 1 and out 2 on the back of the Volt 876. The challenge is, from an input standpoint, on what I'm using as my primary interface, I can only receive 8 channels in. I would need another ADAT input and then run another physical ADAT connection to get all 16 ADAT connections, and then I might be able to leverage the ADAT in of the 876. I do still have the option, potentially, to leave that configuration the way it is with the aux plugged into the input of the Volt 876. And then what I would do is change the Volt 876 from ADAT standalone mode to USB mode. And then I could take advantage of the ADAT in on the Volt 876 so that I could use my aux in particular. That way I could record either the Benson amp or my matchless with all my guitar pedals running into the aux. However, that's not likely. I realize that it's just another point of failure that I don't want to mess with. So what I'm going to do instead is remove the aux from this design entirely. Like, I've actually set it aside. Maybe I'll list it on Reverb. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with that, just because it's not worth changing the configuration for the Volt 876 from ADAT standalone mode into USB mode, because I might have to recalibrate the settings, and I don't want to mess with the setup because it's working great right now. So if you look at the design, this is the current state, I can take my guitar, and right now I'm splitting the connection, meaning I'm only running straight into the pedal board without like going through a DI, for example. But that is something that I might do in the future. With all this flexibility, I might in the future decide to run a DI track for my recorded guitar, and then instead of plugging directly into my pedal board and then recording my amps through the microphones, I might actually want to supply a DI track if I'm recording for another artist, or if a engineer requests that I include a DI track in addition to my amp recordings. You know, because I'm recording in my room, it might not be the best tone for whatever their standard is, and they might want a DI track so they could reamp the performance in their studio and run it through whatever plugins they have or other amps they have. They can do whatever they want with the performance and not have to use my amp recordings if it doesn't work for them for whatever reason. And if I'm not recording the amps, I'm probably going to record digitally. So I'm either going to record the neural DSP or maybe a plugin like the Mixwave 2 Rock plugin or Paradise from Universal Audio. I've got a ton of options there. So if I'm running my guitar for that purpose of recording like digitally so that, you know, my wife doesn't have to hear it and my neighbors don't have to hear me playing guitar at volume, then I just plug the guitar into input 1 on the Volt 876. And from there, I'm actually sending line 3 and 4 out on the back of the Apollo. So I can run from that Volt 876 connection with my guitar, I can run that same signal into the neural DSP as well as the Neve DI. That gives me the flexibility to play guitar, you know, and run into the neural DSP, but also load all my plugins because I've configured all of those to look for the Volt 876 input as the source. And then I've updated all the virtual channels so that I can record the amps, you know, in real time, and then also record that DI track. So very cool feature there. So, and because I'm running line 3 and 4 out to the Neve DI, what I could do is instead of connecting the through into the micro SVT, I could just run that into my pedal board. So that's another option I have, is I can just use this exact configuration, take the Neve DI out of the micro VR. I keep saying SVT, but I mean micro VR, and then run that connection into my pedal board. So that way I can record a DI track and then also have the connection running through my amps, which are now dedicated to the Apollo X4. Super awesome. That means I don't have to move connections around all the time. And because I have these 2 additional analog inputs, I can definitely expand. Right now, I decided that if I'm going to use the Rode for recording directly into my camera and not recording into my DAW, for example, I can just switch the front analog connection a lot easier if I just have that option. That way I don't have to leave a cable out that I have to step over or figure out how to like route under my carpet or something like that. And primarily, I'm just going to run into the SM7 to record voiceovers for screen recording and training videos and stuff like that. I'll probably just leave that connection in place and then leave the Rode connected to my other camera and just record that directly into the camera, even though I'm not going through any kind of mic pre or anything fancy. I'm just going right into the camera and then editing all of the audio in post. But that's a good segue into the Universal Audio console settings. All right, so let's take a look at the Universal Audio console configuration now. So as you can see, I've got all 4 of my inputs on the Apollo X4, so analog 1, 2, 3, and 4, all running Unison plugins. So for the mic pre's, I've got either the 610, the Helio 69, or in the case of the AKG C414, which is the XLS version in my case, I'm running the Neve 1073. I actually record what I'm hearing through those mic pre's. I could always just monitor what's happening, but I just commit the recording, and that's how I do it. Now, if I ever had an issue with the way that sounded, you know, or if it's deteriorating the tone in some way, I could just turn that off entirely and just record the mic directly into the channel. Or I could switch the insert so that instead of recording what I'm hearing, I could just monitor it. That would preserve the mic recording without being affected by the settings that I'm running in the actual plugin. And if you look here, you can see that I've got ADAT 1 all the way through ADAT 8. So this represents the Volt 876 connection. So if you go back to my diagram, you may have noticed that I've got an image of the cloud filter that my SM7 is connected to. Without that, I have to run the SM7 a lot hotter, and I have it, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to put this back into the mix and see how it sounds, and I'm really happy with it. You can see that I've got analog 1 on the Volt 876 set to instrument mode, and again, that's because I have an instrument cable dedicated for running guitar, either bass or guitar, through that connection. Something I want to point out here is how I've got my clock sources set. Right now, you're looking at the settings for the Apollo X4. So if I go into settings, you'll see that under hardware, I've got the device set to Apollo. My clock source is actually set to ADAT, not internal. And then if you look at the hardware settings on the Volt 876, I'm running an ADAT mode with the same clock rate, but the clock source is set to internal. It took me a minute to figure this out and really wrap my head around it, but essentially, I think of it like this. I'm using the Apollo X4 as my primary interface, and it's listening for input from the Volt 876. So before, I was using the Universal Audio X4 as an internal clock source, and it was not receiving the input from the ADAT out on the Volt 876. So what I ended up doing was changing the clock on the Volt 876 to internal, and then on the Apollo X4, I changed the clock source to ADAT to listen to, this is how I think of it, to listen to the Volt 876 for that input signal so that it could not only see the connections, but actually record them without any kind of degradation in the line. And I actually was having all kinds of issues with the quad cortex trying to record, the stereo connection that I've got set up on ADAT 3 and 4, which is the, on the back of the Volt 876, it's those first two connections. So right here, I've got analog 3 and 4 running directly into the quad cortex, out, left, and right. So I can record in stereo now from that device. But I wasn't able to get a good signal. It felt like very choppy, like it'll be working great and then it just like cuts out, or it will, the signal will spike. Weird anomalies will occur. And I couldn't wrap my head around like what was happening. Did I, mislabel something? And it took a long time for me to just like step away and think about that, partly because when I look at this YouTube video from Universal Audio and I look at about 1.5 minutes into that video, the perspective of the video is saying the Apollo X4 with the X4 acting as the master clock and the 876 receiving clock via the ADAT connection. That threw me off. This video gave me the impression that I had to manually set the X4 to internal and the Volt 876 to ADAT for its clock. When I changed the clock to internal on the Apollo X4 and then changed the clock on the Volt 876 to ADAT, the connection doesn't work. I can still see all the connections, but I don't ever actually receive a clean signal, either from the mic or from my guitar input. And so that's why I changed that. And now if you look at the hardware manual for the Volt 876, it talks a little bit about this, but it doesn't go into a super detailed explanation about it. However, if you look here, and this is the UAD console setting for the Volt 876, you'll see this image here where the Volt 876 is running in ADAT mode with a clock rate of whatever they're using in this example, and then the clock is set to internal. So as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, I should change my own settings to match this particular knowledge article. And the minute I did that, everything just worked beautifully. And I just wanted to point that out because it can be confusing. It's like, if you look at this manual, so it's the UAD console map or knowledge article, if you will, for the Volt 876, which is a little bit different than the hardware manual for the Volt 876, which is a lot more comprehensive. This is like the user manual for the Volt 876, a little bit different from the UAD console manual for the Volt 876. I wanted to share that with you in case you also have either an Apollo with just 2 inputs or the Apollo X4, or if you're running, the Apollo X8, for example, and you just want to run an 876 because it's a better price point in ADAT standalone mode, you might run into a similar issue getting the clock source set. And I hope that makes sense. I know that's kind of a lot of terminology. Anyway, so you can see that I've got everything labeled now. So I've got the neural quad cortex running in stereo. So I've linked ADAT 3 and 4 so that I can run that connection in stereo. And then I've got my Neve DI, the micro SVT, and I have 2 open connections. And then I've got a bunch of virtual channels. Those are dedicated to my amp plugins. So like the Benson Chimera, the Milkman Creamer plugin. Where it says Dumble here, I'm actually testing out the John Mayer plugin from Neural, which is fantastic if you have a Strat or a single coil guitar of some sort and you want to play the blues and get clean tones and that edge breakup stuff. It's pretty incredible. It's like freakishly good. All of these plugins are. So the 2-Rock plugin from Mixwave, amazing. I love it. It's awesome. It's like having a 2-Rock in your computer, and then I'm running the SVT software bundle from Ampeg, and then I've got the Parallax plugin as well as the SLO 100 from Mike Saldano and the folks over at Neural. So I've got a ton of virtual amps, and also I could run the Fuchs Unison plugin here if I wanted to record that, or I could just load it into, the Hi-Z connection. I could just load the Fuchs plugin there. Okay, so moving into my digital audio workstation, you can see that I have all of my connections labeled now. So I've got some stereo connections that I can work with. I've got my Neural stereo connection, all those plugins, and then just like the individual channels. So I've got my ribbon mic, the OMA microphone in front of the Benson. I've got my electric guitar DI, which is the Apollo 876 input 1, the SM7, this mic that I'm talking in right now, the Neural right, Neural left. If I, for some reason, wanted to record 2 mono tracks of the Neural, which in most cases I would just run that in a stereo connection if I'm using an effect or something, just makes it easier. And then I've got the micro VR and then 2 open connections. The way I did that is if you go to settings in Live and you look at the input config, I can label my connections. So mono inputs, just think of it as this is row 1, this is row 2 in this case. So like connection 1 is the Benson OMA, connection 2 is the SM57 in front of the Benson. And then for my outputs, I was able to label that as well. So outputs 1 and 2, it's just my studio monitors, so the Atom A7V. I could very easily get confused with these 1/2 input outputs if I don't have them labeled once I get into the flow of stuff. So you can see here in my main out, I've just got the Atom. But then I can change that. I could route it to a virtual channel and do all kinds of other fun stuff. So how does it all sound? The cool thing about having my keyboard back at my desk is that I now have the ability to play the keys. So I can just load a plugin into Ableton Live and actually play keys. This is something I was just kind of messing around with. It'll probably end up being the opening for like a yoga album, and then ask my wife, who's a yoga teacher, she's amazing, to write a sequence to match the album so people can take that online. But, you know, hopefully other yoga teachers might feel inspired to play this in the studio while their students are practicing. So it'll be completely instrumental. And now I can do that just having everything here at my fingertips. Right, little wash at the end there. And so if you look at this, I'm just running the Electric 88 plugin on a MIDI track. So right, so that's how I'm able to play keys directly into my computer running that MIDI track. And it's a lot of fun. And so now I can like layer real amps and software amps and DI tracks and make them sound weird and play the keys, use the push to, you know, automate some filter sweeps and things like that on various MIDI tracks. And then if I wanted to, I could switch to this preview mode and actually like make MIDI clips, you know, track clips that I can like launch and then do live performances and stuff like that. But generally speaking, this is the way I record in Ableton, even though it has a lot more flexibility, of course, as a digital audio workstation. So that's the setup. And I hope this was helpful if you're thinking about expanding your own studio. If you have an Apollo or an Apollo X4, or even if you're using like, you know, Apogee or Focusrite or whatever interface you're using, as long as there's a ADAT in, you should be able to run the 876 in ADAT mode for whatever hardware you're running. I happen to be using Universal Audio, but that doesn't mean it's the only way that it will work. I've committed a lot of time, effort, and money into the Universal Audio production suite, and so it made sense in my case to just stay in that family of products, and I'm very happy with it. It's working great. It did take a lot of work to get there, and I appreciate all of these knowledge articles that are at my disposal. Universal Audio does a great job of putting content out there. I'm always watching this stuff and learning how to use it. Thanks so much for sticking with me this far into the video. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this video of me describing what I believe is a common experience for a lot of recording artists and musicians. My intention with sharing this story is to help anyone who might be in a similar situation and feel stuck. Hopefully watching someone go through the process from beginning to end is helpful and serves more as a compliment to the incredible how-to and quick tip videos Universal Audio has already made available. If you want to see more content like this, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps so much. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you soon.